Hey folks, Shadow of War takes what Shadow of Mordor accomplished and turns it up to 11. The Nemesis system is back and better than ever, along with several new mechanics. We continue Talion's story shortly after the end of the first game as he looks to conquer Mordor and face off against the armies of Sauron once more. The initial hook of the game is the new ring, which is created by Talion and Celebrimbor, and it acts as a good reason for the standard sort of power down that you tend to get with sequel games like this. It's not super fun to start in a overpowered state where you can just steamroll all the weaker enemies, and so you have to find suitable reasons for the players to have lost some power in the sequel, and build your character back up again. And the way that they chose to do this with the ring was by infusing Celebrimbor's power into the ring and then having the ring stolen from us so that we lose the power to dominate along with a few of our other powers that we were familiar with by the end of Shadow of Mordor. The ring gets taken by Shelob, who turns out not just to be a spider, but also a woman. I found this interpretation of Shelob to be very interesting, as there isn't any mention, at least on the wiki, of Shelob having the abilities to transform herself into a woman. But I guess she is apparently the offspring of a primordial being, and that gives enough justification for her to grant us visions and shapeshift when powered up by the ring that she takes from us. I read an interview with one of the devs that said that their interpretation of Shelob was someone who is actually secretly the hero of the Lord of the Rings series, as she's like kind of they saw her as like a dark version of Galadriel, and she played a key role in the destruction of the One Ring as she influenced Gollum by asking him to lead Sam and Frodo to her in her cave. But I think that's quite a reach, to say the least, and I think they actually really just wanted an attractive woman in the game, and they thought that turning Shelob into an attractive woman would be something interesting for players. Speaking of those visions, the first one we're shown is of Minas Ithil, which is shown to get attacked in the future by an Uruk army. So Talion heads there to try and help prevent that, and that starts the first act of the game. For the most part, this act just serves as setup for the story while teaching you how to replay the game. But since I'd just finished playing the first game, I ran through it pretty quickly. Minas Ithil is home to the Palantir, or a Palantir, apparently there's multiple of them, which is a seeing stone that you might remember Saruman using in the movies. It's a powerful tool that allows you to see great distances and communicate with others. Naturally, Sauron wants this, and he sends his armies to capture Minas Ithil and the Palantir. The game uses Hydir as Ubisoft towers, and after capturing them, you have to kind of scout around and look for points of interest. I found it quite tedious to do this, and I would have preferred if it just had the points show up on the map after capturing the tower instead, rather than having to spend all this time just spinning around and making a circle go small enough so I can press R3. The towers point to Shelob memories and challenges. There's much more of an incentive to do these in the game as opposed to the first, as you get skill points for them, which is a much better reward for your time, in my opinion, rather than having to complete every challenge just to get a better sword or whatever it was. I still largely ignored them and didn't really bother with them. I usually don't bother with extra challenges and things like that in games, and it was no different here. That being said, what I did do was definitely improved on than what they had in Shadow of Mordor. We are introduced to our first allies of the game, being General Castamir, his daughter Idril, and Baranor, whom we assist in the first few missions. When Mrs. Ethel does get attacked, as we first saw through Shelob, we assist by taking control of a siege beast, which was a lot of fun, and being able to rain down living artillery fire on giant groups of Uruks and taking out other siege beasts. After this, we go to a new area, and Gollum makes a brief return as a servant of Shelob and helps us track down a traitor of Minas Ithil, who turns out to be the General Castamir, who attempts to save his daughter's life by betraying the city he's supposed to protect. So, not exactly employee of the month or anything. We also face off against our first Olokai, or War Troll, which is a new enemy type in the game and adds a really good amount of variety to basic enemies and captains. If you're able to stun them, you can ride on their back and start stabbing the hell out of them whilst they charge around and flail their arms and knock over other enemies. You can effectively use them as a weapon during your combat encounters. When we return to Mina Cecil, we find the Witch King of Angmar, who's the leader of the Nazgul, uh, is trying to take over the city. During which we are introduced to drakes, which are a new addition and a welcome one, as you get to control them later on and fly through the air and shoot fire at things. The Graug and the Caragors also make a return in this game and are mountable again. Although the Karagafs from the first game's DLC are absent for some reason, which means that the Caragors in this game can't use the speed buff that you get from jumping over rocks, nor can they use stealth, which is a bit of an odd choice to leave out, and it's probably one of the only downgrades in the game, I would say, skills-wise. The Nazgul boss fight was really cool, and the fight itself was quite basic, but fighting the Nazgul was enough for it to be enjoyable for me, and Castamir getting what he deserved also felt pretty good. I mentioned in my last review as well that the sound design team at Monolith must be really incredible, as the sounds of the Nazgul are really well done. It definitely feels like you're fighting these like wraithy spectral enemies with the sound effects that they make. After the fight, we get introduced to another important character, that being Eltariel, the elven Nazgul hunter. She saves us from the Witch King using the light of Galadriel, whom she serves, and the Nazgul then go after Shelob, and after we save her, she returns the new ring to us, and we begin the core of the game in Act 2. With the ring back in our hands, it's time for the main gameplay loop of capturing forts. We of course use the domination powers and the nemesis system to accomplish this, and it's largely the same as the last game with all of the mechanics returning, such as death threats and leveling up your orcs. But a few new strengths and weaknesses come along with it, as well as some other new mechanics. The new thing with this game is fighting the enemy forts. You can choose to weaken them by killing war chiefs beforehand, which reduces the defenses you'll come up against when storming the fort. You also get the opportunity to upgrade the captains you've dominated so that they can bring more allied forces. These are things like Caragors and archers and siege beasts, and they'll bring them with you and help you have a greater ability to capture the forts. There's a good amount of forts in the game. I didn't feel like there was too many or too few, so it didn't get repetitive, and it made for a great core loop that utilized the Nemesis system far better than the first game did. I first went to the forest where I met one of the other main quest givers, Karnan, who is a nature spirit and a very old one at that. I think she's like near primordial. She's what I imagine the Entwives to look like, although as we found out in the movies, they're all missing, so I could be wrong about that. Initially, when we fight her, she takes the form of three animals in the game, the Graug and the Caragor and the Drake. But afterwards, she kind of allies herself with us and tasks us with hunting down a Balrog and the Uruks who are trying to control it. The Balrog's inclusion in this game was quite unexpected, but it was very cool. I think Balrogs are probably the most badass enemies in the Lord of the Rings lore, and the fight against the Balrog was great as well, as you fight alongside Karnan, and you just wail on the thing with Karnan in Graug form. The second time you encounter it is a bit less interesting, as you just kind of shoot it with a Drake, whilst it kind of flails at you, and you have a bit of a QTE thing here and there. But it's still quite a spectacle of a fight. And eventually, Karnan sacrifices herself to lock the Balrog away underneath a frozen lake, and we're left to hunt down the Uruk that are using dark magic to try and control the Balrog and revive it. This part of the game is a bit annoying as you face a lot of high level enemies, and at the same time, you're trying to cleanse these dark towers, which require a decently long channel. And so you end up getting interrupted by archers and things like that constantly, and it's a bit annoying. But overall, Karnan's story was probably my favorite out of the quest givers and had the most interesting moments. We are also introduced to Bruce, an Olaghai who we dominate quite early on. He randomly shows up to teach us various things about the Nemesis system. He's a great character and has a lot of great lines, and the voice actor does a great job with him and his Australian accent. He eventually betrays us and takes over the fort that we first capture, and it makes for quite a compelling enemy as we try to track him down and make an example of him so that other Uruks don't get the idea of betraying us. Ratbag ends up being the overlord of the first fort that you capture, and once again becomes your ally as he was in the first game. He helps you track Bruce after he betrays you, and you help him hunt down Ratbag's friend, who he names Ranger, which is an Olaghai. His character is great, and it's another memorable part of the game. I think a lot of people will remember Ratbag from the first game. He's like the classic coward who acts tough. My biggest gripe with Bruce was that he seems to be the only thing in the game that can become undominated, and he just sort of randomly manages to do it after you don't grant him Overlord status when you capture the first fort. I wish it was explained a bit better, but overall, he's a great character, same with Ratbag. Idril and Baranor return after escaping from Minas Ithil, which is now renamed Minas Morgul, which you might remember from the movies. Their quest involved saving captured Gondorians as Idril tries to make up for her father's mistakes that she feels responsible for. The questline doesn't offer too much, but at least it sets up Baranor's DLC, which I'll discuss later. Altario's quest involved hunting down Nazgul and preventing them from raising Uruk into what they call Chosen. We have boss fights versus various Nazgul, but these Nazgul are specific to the game and aren't canon members of the Nazgul, as there's only two named members of the Nazgul as per the wiki. But for example, Isildur, the man who managed to cut the One Ring off of Sauron's finger and eventually caused it to make its way to Gollum, is a Nazgul in this game, and it's not actually canon, although I quite like the idea. The boss fight versus the Nazgul were all quite unique, and they had their own powers that they use against you. I particularly like the fight versus Helm Hammerhand and his Drakes. At the end of the game, Eltariel ends up betraying Talion and takes the ring, which causes him to almost die, as it's the only thing that's stopping his wound on his throat from opening up. But Shelob intervenes, and he ends up using a Nazgul ring to keep himself alive, and it slowly corrupts him and turns him into a Nazgul after he spends decades fighting back against Sauron's armies and the ring that he bears. Meanwhile, Eltariel and Celebrimbor attempt to take on Sauron, and Celebrimbor ends up being hugged inside of Sauron and joining him as part of the Eye above Barad-dûr. If you take the time to grind out the post game, you get a shortcut scene that showcases Talion becoming a full Nazgul and dying when the One Ring gets destroyed at Mount Doom. But I never finished the post game as the Shadow Wars act as a pretty much just a pain. You go around all of your forts and attempt to defend them from extremely high level Uruk, while all your Uruk will still be the same level as when you encountered them in the story, meaning a lot of them will be 20 to 30 levels lower the Uruk that are attacking, and it just makes it quite difficult. But this section of the game is a leftover from when the game used microtransactions and tried to use them to extend playtime and get me people to spend more money on the game. Thankfully, the microtransactions are patched out nowadays, and it's not really important. But it basically means that the Shadow Wars is pretty much just a leftover, and it's not really worth doing. And so personally, I just ended up watching the cutscene on YouTube when I was done with the game. That's it for the coverage of the base game. There's a couple of extra things I wanted to mention before we cover the DLC. The first thing was the movement in this game. It feels really good. The addition of the double jump and the faster climbing that you can do, as well as the ability to speed boost whenever you want, as long as you have the focus. It made for the map mobility being quick and easy, which was really nice because the game total map size is quite large if you add up all the areas. I should also mention the gear and how that works. Basically, you get weapons and armor that drop from captains when you kill them, and they can have random bonuses and rarities. And the legendary gear also has set bonuses if you equip enough of them. They can't be upgraded very easily, the legendary gear, as most of them seem to require to be like level 40, which is basically end game level. And so I didn't really bother upgrading any legendary stuff. You could also have the chance of finding gems that drop from various Uruk, and you can upgrade these gems over time to give you various passive bonuses on your weapons and armor. Some of the gear could be quite useful, and others was not so much, but they added something small to the gameplay, and it was interesting enough. And you can definitely optimize it and make Talion quite strong if you pay attention to your gear and search out specific parts. The grog poisoning makes a return, and I once again ignored it, except when I needed it. I'm surprised that they brought this back, as I can't imagine many people used it in the first game. But at least the skills you can get in Shadow of War make it much more interesting, although, again, I never really bothered with them. On to the DLC now, and once again, when I last played these games, I didn't play the DLC, so this was a brand new experience for me. The DLCs in this game are another area of improvement over the first game, as while I did enjoy the DLCs in the first game, I felt that Shadow Wars DLC shakes up the formula enough and it makes it feel much more fresh in terms of gameplay. In the first DLC, we play as Eltariel shortly after the end of the game. Upon realizing that Talion is still alive and using a Nazgul ring, being a Nazgul hunter, she is commanded by Galadriel to seek out Talion and stop him. This leads to the first of two boss fights where we actually fight Talion, which reminded me of Prototype 2, where you fight Alex Mercer from the first game. And Talion in his dark form even reminds me a little bit of Alex Mercer. The boss fight is quite repetitive, but it's interesting to see Talion use the abilities that we've used all game against us. The abilities that Altaria will use are based on the usage of the Light of Galadriel. She can blind enemies and then ignite them after infusing them with enough light. It's okay. I didn't really care much for the light powers since most of the captains were immune to it anyway, and it was only really useful for the regular enemies or the ghouls that you fight. Talion ends up besting us in the post-fight cutscene and shows us that he still is in ownership of his minds and hasn't yet succumbed to the ring. Eltariel agrees to help him keep Mordor in a perpetual state of war to buy time for Middle-earth. We do this by finding and adding various unique Uruk to our army, but Altariel refuses to use the ability to dominate them as she's still in possession of the ring that was made at the start of the game. But she doesn't use the domination and instead tries to help them, which incentivizes them to join our cause. The unique Uruk you encounter are a lot of fun and they have a very distinct set of personalities. It's specifically designed for the DLC, so it doesn't use the random element of the Nemesis system and is a much more tailored experience. But once we have our Uruks, we help defend a fort and are introduced to the antagonists of the DLCs, that being the twin Nazgul who use these sickles on chains. And they seem to be trying to take Mordor from themselves, going against Sauron in his weakened state. They leave shortly after, and Talion mentions that another fort will be attacked soon. So we head there and gain some new allies, whom were my favorite of the DLC, that being Flint and Tinder, who had a childlike wonder, shall we say, when it comes to explosions. But I had a sad moment happen when one of them died when we stormed the last fort. I also enjoyed the enchanted Uruk, who was in love with Altariel, even if he did make me cringe quite a bit. We managed to successfully raid the second keep and move on to the final one of the DLC, which was occupied by the Nazgul sisters. The fight versus the sisters had a couple of new mechanics, which involved using our light to break the chains that they bound us with, and using the light to lower the defenses to allow us to damage them. It was a simple fight, really, but the animations on the Nazgul were good enough that it made for quite an interesting experience. I think it would have been nice if they had had different attacks, so it didn't just feel like I was fighting two of the same enemy, and they actually had ways to differentiate themselves from each other. After this, we meet with Talon once again and attempt to take his ring, but he requests to die in Gondor instead of Mordor. So we arrive back in Minas Morgul, and when we get there, Talion is too corrupted by the ring and refuses to give it up. So we are forced to fight him again. This time, however, he is joined by the Nazgul, and it changes up the fight a little bit with the extra enemies, but ultimately it was a repeat of the first fight and wasn't really much different. This DLC was okay, it was quite good, but I didn't really enjoy Altariel's abilities that much. And whilst the Uruks in the boss fight made up for that, I don't think the DLC did anything too different, but it was enjoyable enough. The second DLC has us playing as Baranor as he attempts to escape some wereworms in a desert. He is saved by Torvin from the first game, which was a surprise, but not really a welcome one, as he wasn't my favorite character. But thankfully, he has very little involvement in the DLC outside of being a upgrade station and saving us in the beginning. He gives us a grappling hook and a parachute, which is how Baranor moves around the map, since he's mortal and doesn't have the elf powers of the last two characters that we played as. It also means that death is permanent for him, and therefore the game kind of works like a roguelike, where you can make partial progress by collecting upgrades and completing story missions, and those stay unlocked or finished even if you die. But any outposts that you captured will fall into enemy hands again, meaning you have to do that again if you die. I did manage to beat this DLC without dying, so that wasn't something I ever had to deal with. It's not really the hardest thing to stay alive in the DLC because you can pretty much pause the game whenever you want and open up a weapon wheel, and in that weapon wheel you use potions to heal yourself, and they immediately put you to full HP. So it's as long as you're paying attention to your health bar, it's quite easy to stay alive. For the other tools, Baranor has access to a crossbow and a retractable shield. The crossbow can have various different bolts attached, which you can use fire, poison, and ice. You can also use bomb variants of those, which do an AoE explosion instead. To upgrade these abilities, you need to find various landmarks around the map, which Torvin gives you at the start. You find a floating icon in these landmarks and you can take it back to Torben and he'll exchange it for upgrades for your abilities. I didn't particularly like this as the location of the icon were a bit hard to tell sometimes, so I ended up just looking them up and watching a video instead of spending a bunch of extra time hunting them down, which ultimately I personally wouldn't have enjoyed very much. You can also find upgrades for your weapons and armor that are dropped from the enemies that you kill. These can range anywhere from simple damage buffs to altering how the weapons work. It seems random what you get, but perhaps if you play on harder difficulties, it can make a difference as to maybe you need to hunt down certain buffs in order to complete the fort. For the story, after leaving Torn in the beginning, we travel to meet up with mercenaries to hire them and take the fort in the desert. And when we get there, it turns out that the leader of the mercs is actually Baranor's brother. We hire mercs as bodyguards and use them to capture outposts, which, when held, give us bonuses when we choose to storm the fort. There's a small number of quests that you need to do before storming the fort. You'll help out the mercs destroy a supply line where a giant werewolf will destroy the mountain pass. You can save your brother from being captured and betrayed and defend the merc camp from an Uruk attack. I took out some, but not all of the war chiefs before assaulting the fort, and I didn't really have too much trouble with it. The fort capture itself is the same as in the base game and the other DLC. There's nothing extra there except for the fact that your brother will join you at the end Overlord fight. Afterwards, you destroy the fort by baiting the giant wereworm to attack it, and that's pretty much it. The DLC felt quite fresh and was a nice way to end my playtime with the game, as it was different enough from the main game while still feeling like Shadow of War. Baranor was much more enjoyable to play as instead of Altariel, as his attacks and powers were quite fun and unique, especially the chain whip attack that knocks all the enemies down, and the crossbow bombs was also really fun to use. I did find the lack of mention of Idril to be a bit weird, since the last we saw Baranor, he left with Idril and claimed he would be fighting alongside her in Mordor, but she doesn't turn up at all in the DLC, and I think she gets mentioned maybe once, but that's it. So that was Shadow of War. I'm very happy that it decided to return to the Middle Earth games, and they were actually even better than I remembered, especially Shadow of War. So playing through the DLCs for the first time was great, and messing around with the Nemesis system is always a good time. I hope that we see more out of that system in the future, but it's currently held hostage by Warner Brothers copyright, so it may be a while before we get another game like these great games. If you enjoyed, consider watching my video on Shadow of Mordor if you missed it. Leave a like and comment, and thanks for watching.